I gave my sister $1,000 a week only to have her call me a loser when I got fired from my job, so I cut her off and now my parents have stepped in. I smiled and said this. Growing up, I always believed that family came first. I prided myself on being dependable, the one who could step up when others needed help. So when my parents, Diane and Thomas, came to me with what they called a small favor to support my younger sister, Charlotte, as she started college, I didn't think twice about hearing them out. We're just so worried about Charlotte, my mom began one evening over dinner. College is such a big adjustment, and we don't want her to feel left out. I looked up from my plate, confused. Left out? What do you mean? My dad leaned forward, a concerned look on his face. Her friends are going to be from wealthier families. They'll have expensive clothes, fancy trips, and all the extras. Charlotte's already feeling the pressure. We don't want her to stand out in a bad way. I didn't understand why this was such a big deal. Charlotte was 19, perfectly capable of making her own way, and my parents weren't exactly struggling financially. They had just come back from a luxury cruise to Greece and recently leased a new SUV. But they were making this sound urgent, even critical. What are you asking me to do? I asked cautiously. Mom's voice softened, the way it always did when she was trying to coax me into something. We were hoping you could help her out financially. Just a little bit every week, so she doesn't have to worry about fitting in. How much are we talking about? I asked, my stomach tightening. Just $1,000 a week, she said, as if the amount was completely reasonable. It's not just for tuition or books. She'll need money for clothes, outings, and other things to keep up with her peers. Istede here, stunt, $1,000? Every week? That's $4,000 a month. Mom, that's not a little help. That's a lot. Come on, Alex, Dad said, using his usual calm tone to diffuse my hesitation. It's just temporary, just until she settles in and gets comfortable. I wanted to argue, to explain how unreasonable this all felt, but I couldn't shake the guilt creeping in. Charlotte and I weren't particularly close, but I didn't want her to feel like she didn't belong. My parents framed it like I was helping her avoid a lifetime of insecurity, and somehow, they made it seem like I was the only one who could step up. Reluctantly, I agreed. Fine, but this is temporary, right? Of course, Mom said with a smile. You're doing such a good thing, Alex. Charlotte is lucky to have a brother like you. At first, I felt like I was doing something important. I told myself the money would go toward necessities, textbooks, groceries, maybe the occasional dinner out. But it didn't take long for me to notice things weren't adding up. Charlotte's texts came regularly, each one more casual than the last. Hey, did you send the money yet? She'd ask, as if the $1,000 was just another routine bill. I assumed she was using it responsibly until I saw her during a family gathering a few months later. She walked in wearing a brand new designer handbag and dressed in expensive clothes. Is that new? I asked, motioning to the bag. Oh, this? She said nonchalantly. Yeah, I just had to have it. Isn't it cute? My parents beamed. She has such great taste, Mom said proudly. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she had splurged once. But week after week, her spending habits became harder to ignore. Social media posts of lavish dinners, weekend trips, and shopping sprees painted a very different picture from the one my parents had sold me. I started to wonder if any of the money was being used for school at all. Meanwhile, my own life became increasingly stressful. To afford Charlotte's weekly allowance, I had to take on a second job delivering food at night. My days were spent at my full-time job, and my evenings were spent navigating the city, exhausted and drained. I cut back on everything, eating out, meeting friends, even buying new clothes for myself, just to make sure I could keep up with Charlotte's demands. Every time I brought up the financial strain with my parents, they brushed me off. She's still adjusting, Mom would say. College is such a big step. Let her enjoy it. But she's not looking for a job, I argued. Shouldn't she take some responsibility? Her focus should be on her studies, Dad replied. You know how important this time is for her. I felt trapped. My parents made me feel like questioning the arrangement was selfish, and Charlotte showed no signs of appreciating what I was doing for her. Every week, I sent the money, telling myself it was temporary. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to end anytime soon. And as the months dragged on, I began to wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. It didn't take long for my parents' temporary favor to feel like a permanent sentence. Week after week, I was transferring $1,000 to Charlotte, telling myself it was for her college essentials. But the longer it went on, the more I started to notice the cracks in the story my parents had sold me. At first, I tried to believe the best, that Charlotte was using the money responsibly. But her texts became increasingly casual, almost transactional. "Hey, did you send the money yet?" she'd ask, as if she were reminding me to pay her utility bill. There was no gratitude, no acknowledgement of what I was doing for her. It felt less like helping a sibling and more like a chore. Then there were her social media posts. Pictures of her at high-end restaurants, shopping sprees, and weekends away started to show up with increasing regularity. I convinced myself that maybe she was splurging with her own money, but deep down, I knew better. One day, I saw her posing with a group of friends in front of a beachside resort, the caption reading, "Spring break vibes." It stung, knowing I was back home working 12-hour shifts to fund her fun. The final confirmation came during a family dinner at my parents' house. I had just come from my second job, exhausted and still wearing my delivery uniform. Charlotte walked in, laughing with her friends, carrying bags from high-end stores. She dropped them on the couch and sat down, showing off a new bracelet that probably cost more than my rent. "Thanks for this, by the way," she said, waving her wrist. I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Oh, I used some of the money you sent. I just had to have it." She laughed like it was no big deal. I was speechless. I thought that money was for rent, groceries, and textbooks, I finally said. Charlotte shrugged. "It was on sale. Besides, I needed something nice to wear out with my friends." My mom, sitting across from me, didn't even blink. "She has such good taste, doesn't she?" I couldn't believe it. My parents, the ones who had guilted me into sending Charlotte $1,000 a week, were now justifying her spending on luxury items. I wanted to speak up, but I was too tired to argue. I left that night feeling more used than ever. As the months passed, I started to see how lopsided the arrangement was. I was working 2 jobs, eating instant noodles most nights, and skipping any semblance of a social life just to keep up with Charlotte's lifestyle. Meanwhile, my parents continued to insist that it was all for her future. "She's still adjusting to college life," Mom would say whenever I voiced concerns. "You know how hard it is to fit in these days." "She'll figure it out eventually," Dad added. "It's just a phase." But it wasn't a phase. Charlotte showed no interest in finding a part-time job or cutting back on her spending. She had everything handed to her and saw no reason to change. Every time I tried to bring up the possibility of scaling back the payments, my parents brushed me off. "You know how much pressure she's under," Mom said during one of these conversations. "She's trying to focus on her studies. She doesn't need to worry about money right now." "Right, because I should be the one worrying about money," I snapped. "You don't seem to care that I'm killing myself to keep this up." "You're young," Dad replied. "You can handle it. This is about helping your sister." Their dismissal of my struggles only added to my frustration. I was working 60-hour weeks between 2 jobs, barely getting enough sleep, and constantly falling behind on my own goals. But none of that seemed to matter. To them, I was just the dependable older brother who would always step up, no matter how much it cost me. Charlotte's entitlement became increasingly blatant. One evening, she called me to ask for even more money. "I need an extra $300 this week," she said casually. "For what?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "My friends are going to Miami, and I can't be the only one not going," she replied, as if this were a perfectly reasonable request. I couldn't hide my irritation. "Charlotte, I'm already sending you $1,000 a week. That's more than enough." "Well, if you manage your money better, this wouldn't be a problem," she said, her tone laced with annoyance. That comment hit me like a punch. All I could do was hang up and stare at the wall, too stunned to respond. It was clear that Charlotte didn't see me as a person anymore. To her, I was just an endless source of money. And my parents? They were the ones who had created this monster, enabling her entitlement and turning a blind eye to my sacrifices. I started to wonder how much longer I could keep this up. But deep down, I already knew the answer. I couldn't. Something had to change, and soon. I just wasn't sure how to make that happen without completely falling apart. The cracks in my family's expectations became impossible to ignore. What started as a favor to support Charlotte through college had spiraled into something far more toxic. My parents' promises that it was temporary were nothing more than empty reassurances, and Charlotte's entitlement had reached a point where it no longer even surprised me, but it still hurt. It all came to a head one evening after a particularly grueling day. I had worked 14 hours straight between my two jobs, my body aching and my mind fogged with exhaustion. Just as I collapsed onto the couch, my phone buzzed. It was Charlotte. "Hey, Alex. I need an extra $400 this week," she said without even a hello. I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard. An extra $400? For what? "My friends are planning a trip to Miami, and I can't be the only one not going," she said casually, like she was asking for a ride, not hundreds of dollars. "Charlotte, I already send you $1,000 a week," I said, my voice tense. "That's more than enough." She sighed, clearly irritated. "Well, if you manage your money better, this wouldn't even be an issue. I mean, you're the one always saying you work so much." Her words hit me like a slap. I couldn't believe her audacity. "Charlotte," I said, struggling to keep my voice calm, "do you even realize how hard I'm working to send you that money? I'm juggling two jobs just to keep up with your expenses, and you're telling me I need to manage my money better?" She scoffed. "Look, I don't need a lecture. Are you sending it or not?" That was it. I snapped. "No, Charlotte. I'm not sending you any more money. You're going to have to figure it out." There was silence on the other end, followed by a cold, cutting response. "Wow. So you're just going to let me embarrass myself in front of my friends? Do you know how selfish that is?" I hung up before I could say something I'd regret. My hands were shaking, my chest tight with frustration. I had spent years sacrificing everything. My time, my health, my social life for Charlotte, and she couldn't even acknowledge it. To her, I wasn't her brother. I was just a walking ATM. The next day my mom called. "Why are you being so difficult?" she asked, her tone accusatory. "Charlotte told me you refused to send her money. You know how important this trip is to her." "Mom, are you serious right now?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm working myself to the bone to send her $1,000 every week. And now you expect me to give her more so she can go on vacation? Well, maybe if you weren't so negative about everything, you'd be in a better position financially," she replied, as though my struggles were my own fault. "Charlotte needs a dependable brother to look up to." Her words stung, but they also made me realize something. My parents didn't see me as a person anymore either. To them, I was a role to be filled, a provider, nothing more. My exhaustion, my sacrifices, my needs didn't matter. All that mattered was that Charlotte got what she wanted. A few weeks later, my worst fears came true. The strain of working two jobs had caught up with me, and I lost my primary job. When I told my parents, I hoped, foolishly, that they'd offer some kind of support or at least words of encouragement. Instead, my dad said, "Well, you'd better find something fast. Charlotte's counting on you." Charlotte's reaction was even worse. When I called to explain that I couldn't keep sending her money, she said, "You're kidding, right? What am I supposed to do now? You know I depend on that money." I took a deep breath. "Charlotte, you're going to have to figure it out. I can't keep doing this." Her response floored me. "You're so selfish. You're ruining my life over what? Your rent? You always figure it out. Why not now?" It was like she didn't even see me as a person anymore. I hung up the phone and sat there in silence, the weight of it all crushing me. I had given everything I could to my family, and when I couldn't give anymore, they turned on me. The final blow came when I received an eviction notice. I had fallen behind on my rent while still trying to send money to Charlotte, hoping to avoid the inevitable blow-up. When Charlotte found out I had moved into a small, dingy studio apartment, she called me, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for me to have a brother living in a dump?" she sneered. I didn't even respond. I just hung up, realizing that nothing I did would ever be enough. For years, I had bent over backward to support Charlotte and keep my parents happy. But in their eyes, I wasn't a person. I was a paycheck. And now that I couldn't give anymore, they had no use for me. It was in that moment that I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for people who didn't care about me. It was time to take my life back, no matter how hard it would be. It wasn't until I finally hit rock bottom that I began to see the full scope of how much I'd been manipulated. For years, I had told myself that I was helping my family, that my sacrifices were for a good cause. But the reality was far more twisted than I could have ever imagined. After losing my job, I called my older brother, Marcus, out of sheer desperation. We'd never been particularly close, but I needed someone to talk to. Someone who wasn't tangled up in the endless web of guilt and obligations my parents had spun around me. I told him everything. The $1,000 weekly payments to Charlotte, the second job, the eviction, and how our parents seemed to view me as nothing more than a bank account. Marcus was silent for a long moment after I finished. "Wait," he finally said. "They told you they couldn't afford to help Charlotte?" "Yeah," I replied. "They said they didn't have the money and wanted me to step in." "That's bullshit," Marcus snapped, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Do you know where they've been living?" "In your downtown condo," I said. "They sold the old house and needed a place to stay, right?" Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "Alex, they didn't sell the house. They rented it out. They've been collecting rent for years. Meanwhile, they've been living in my condo rent-free because they told me they couldn't afford anything else. And now I find out they've been having you fund Charlotte's lifestyle? This is insane." I sat there, stunned. "They told me they sold it because they were struggling financially," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They lied to you," Marcus said firmly. "They've been sitting on rental income this whole time. You're out here working yourself to death, and they're living comfortably while letting you foot the bill." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. For years, I'd carried this burden, believing my parents were struggling and that I was the only one who could help Charlotte. Now I realized I'd been manipulated into playing the role of the family provider while they kept their own finances intact. "What about Charlotte?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. "Did she know?" "I doubt it," Marcus said, "but it doesn't matter. She's been taking advantage of you too. The difference is, she doesn't need to know about mom and dad's lies to know that $1,000 a week is excessive." Anger and betrayal washed over me in waves. I had worked 2 jobs, skipped meals, and lived in near poverty for years to fund Charlotte's designer bags and vacations, all while my parents had been sitting on extra income and living rent-free. And they had the audacity to tell me I wasn't doing enough. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked, pulling me out of my thoughts. I didn't know how to respond. For so long, I'd been trapped in this cycle of guilt and obligation, believing that saying no would mean I was failing as a son and a brother. But now I realized that my family had been failing me all along. Marcus didn't wait for me to decide. "I'll tell you what I'm going to do," he said. "They've had a free ride for long enough. I'm giving them 30 days to move out of my condo." "You're kicking them out?" I asked, shocked. "Absolutely," Marcus replied. "They've been using both of us for years, Alex. It's time they face the consequences." True to his word, Marcus confronted our parents the next day. He told them they had 30 days to move out, and when they tried to argue, he laid everything out. The rental income they'd been hiding, the cruises and luxury dinners they'd indulged in, and the fact that they'd let me destroy my health and finances to support Charlotte. When my parents called me later that day, I braced myself for the backlash. Diane's voice was sharp with anger. "How could you turn Marcus against us?" she demanded. "Do you know what you've done? We're losing everything because of you." "You're losing everything?" I shot back. "I've already lost my job, my home, and my peace of mind because of you. You lied to me, manipulated me, and let me carry a burden that wasn't mine to carry. Don't talk to me about loss." They didn't want to hear it. Thomas accused me of being ungrateful, of failing as a son. But for the first time, their guilt trips didn't work. I hung up, exhausted but resolute. I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. Charlotte, on the other hand, reacted with tears. "What am I supposed to do now?" she sobbed when she called me. "Mom and Dad said they can't afford to help me because of you and Marcus. I don't even have money for a new handbag." I laughed bitterly. After everything I'd been through, her biggest concern was her lack of luxury items. "You'll figure it out," I said coldly. The way I had to. That night, I lay in bed, replaying the revelations over and over in my mind. The betrayal cut deep, but it also brought clarity. I wasn't going to be their pawn anymore. It was time to take back control of my life, no matter what it cost. After everything I'd been through, losing my job, my home, and my peace of mind, I thought I was finally done with Charlotte and my parents' endless demands. But just when I began to put the pieces of my life back together, Charlotte took things to an entirely new level. If I thought her entitlement couldn't get worse, her next move proved me wrong. It started with a text from Marcus. "You're not going to believe this," he wrote, attaching a link. Curious but apprehensive, I clicked on it, and what I saw made my stomach drop. It was a GoFundMe page, and the title read, "Help me rebuild after family abandonment." At first, I thought it had to be a joke, but as I read through the description, I realized it wasn't. Charlotte had written a sob story about how she'd been cut off by her family without warning and was now struggling to make ends meet. She painted herself as the victim of heartless relatives who had left her with nothing. She claimed she was unable to afford basic necessities, let alone maintain the stability she'd once had. The goal? A staggering $50,000. My jaw tightened as I read on. Not once did she mention the years of $1,000 weekly payments I'd sent her, or how she had used that money to buy designer bags and take lavish vacations. Instead, she played the part of the abandoned daughter, completely rewriting the narrative to suit her. What made it worse were the comments pouring in from strangers and her friends. "Stay strong, Charlotte. You deserve so much better. Family should always have your back. You're so brave for speaking out. Don't let them bring you down. You've got this." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Brave? Speaking out? She wasn't brave. She was lying, and people were eating it up. To my horror, she had already raised over $2,000 in donations within a few hours of launching the page. I called Marcus immediately. "Did you see this?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "Oh, I saw it," he replied, his tone calm but laced with sarcasm. "Our sister is quite the storyteller, isn't she? What do we do?" I asked, feeling a mix of rage and helplessness. "If we try to tell the truth, we'll look like the bad guys. We don't let her get away with it. That's what we do," Marcus said firmly. The next day, Marcus left a comment on her GoFundMe page, cutting straight through her lies. "Before you donate, ask Charlotte where the $1,000 a week she's been getting for years went, or the thousands of dollars our family has sacrificed to support her. Ask her about the vacations, the designer bags, and the nights out she spent it on while we worked ourselves into the ground. This fundraiser is a scam." I held my breath as I watched the fallout unfold. The comment section, once full of sympathy, turned into a battleground. People started questioning her story. "Wait, is this true? Did you really get $1,000 a week? How do you explain all the luxury stuff on your Instagram if you're supposedly struggling? I want my money back. This feels shady." Charlotte scrambled to do damage control, deleting Marcus's comment and blocking him from the page, but the damage was already done. Screenshots of the comment had started circulating, and more people were starting to see through her lies. Donations dried up almost overnight, and the public sympathy she'd been soaking up began to wane. Charlotte didn't take it well. She posted a long rant on Instagram, accusing Marcus and me of ruining her life and claiming that we had turned our backs on her in her time of need. "I trusted my family," she wrote. "I thought they would always be there for me, but instead, they humiliated me. They made me out to be the villain when all I ever wanted was to succeed." Her friends chimed in with supportive comments, but they were fewer than before. Some people started calling her out directly. "You didn't mention the $1,000 a week in this rant either. Care to explain? If you trusted your family, maybe you shouldn't have lied about them." By the end of the week, Charlotte had deactivated her Instagram and taken down the GoFundMe page without a word. But the damage was already done, not just to her reputation, but to the thin threads that still connected our family. My parents, of course, came to her defense. Diane called me, her voice dripping with anger. "How could you and Marcus humiliate Charlotte like that? She's devastated." "She humiliated herself, Mom," I said bluntly. "She lied, and people saw through it. That's not on us." "She's your sister," Diane shot back. "You're supposed to protect her, not tear her down." "Protect her," I said, my frustration boiling over. "I've spent years protecting her. I destroyed my health, my finances, and my sanity to give her everything she wanted. And this is how she repays me, by lying about it and dragging me through the mud. I'm done. The conversation ended with Diane blaming me for everything, as usual. But for the first time, her words didn't sting the way they used to. I was too exhausted, too numb to care. As for Charlotte, she tried one last-ditch effort to guilt me. She showed up at my apartment a few days later, unannounced and furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" she demanded, barging in like she owned the place. "What I've done to you?" I said, barely able to hold back my anger. "You lied about me, about Marcus, about everything. And you expect me to feel sorry for you?" "I needed that money," she shouted. "No, you wanted that money," I snapped. "There's a difference, Charlotte." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I watched her leave, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. I knew then that I was done, truly done, with her manipulations. She had taken enough from me, and I wasn't going to give her one more ounce of my energy. Breaking free from her and my parents wasn't easy, but it was necessary. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. I'd like to say that after everything, my parents finally saw the light, that they realized how much damage they'd done to me and to the family dynamic. But that would be a lie. If anything, they doubled down, digging themselves deeper into denial and finding new ways to place the blame squarely on me. It started shortly after Marcus exposed Charlotte's GoFundMe scam. Her reputation was already in tatters, and she had been forced to take the page down. While I had hoped my parents would acknowledge the truth, and maybe even hold Charlotte accountable, Diane and Thomas only became more defensive. One evening, Diane called me out of the blue. The moment I picked up, her accusatory tone made it clear where the conversation was headed. "How could you and Marcus do this to Charlotte?" she demanded. "She's heartbroken. Do you know how much you've humiliated her?" I rubbed my temples, already exhausted from the day. "Humiliated her?" I shot back. "Mom, she lied to everyone. She made me out to be the villain after I spent years sacrificing everything for her. What part of that is my fault? You didn't have to make it public," she snapped. "Marcus didn't have to leave that comment. This could have been handled privately like a family. But instead, you two ruined her reputation." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "She ruined her own reputation, Mom. We didn't force her to create a fake GoFundMe. She did that all on her own." Diane refused to listen. "Charlotte is devastated, Alex. You and Marcus have torn this family apart." At that moment, I realized my mother wasn't interested in hearing the truth. She wasn't willing to face the fact that Charlotte's entitlement and the chaos it had caused was a direct result of their enabling. To her, it was easier to blame me and Marcus than to admit they'd been complicit. Thomas wasn't any better. The next day, he called me with a similar tirade. "Your mother is beside herself, Alex," he began, his voice thick with frustration. "You and Marcus went too far this time." "Too far?" I repeated, incredulous. "I've spent years breaking my back for this family, and you're telling me I went too far by finally standing up for myself?" "You've always been the dependable one," he replied. "That's what we've counted on. We trusted you to hold this family together." "Trusted me?" I said, my voice rising. "You didn't trust me. You used me. You let me destroy myself working 2 jobs to support Charlotte while you and Mom sat back and enjoyed your cruises and luxury dinners. And now that I'm done, you want to blame me for everything falling apart." "Don't talk to me like that," Thomas snapped. "We've sacrificed plenty for this family." "Sacrificed?" I couldn't stop myself from laughing bitterly. "Like the rental income you never told me about? Or the free housing you've been getting from Marcus for years? Please, Dad, tell me more about your sacrifices." There was a long pause before he said, "Charlotte needed us to support her. We did what was best for her." "And what about me?" I asked. "Did you ever stop to think about what I needed? Or was I just supposed to keep giving until there was nothing left of me?" The conversation ended the way most of them did, with Thomas hanging up, unwilling to admit any fault. Marcus wasn't spared their wrath either. Diane and Thomas showed up at his office a few days later, demanding to know why he had evicted them from the downtown condo. "You had no right to do this to us," Diane said, her voice trembling with anger. "We're your parents. We needed that place." "You didn't need it," Marcus replied coolly. You used it as a safety net while letting Alex carry the financial burden of supporting Charlotte. That's over now. Thomas slammed his fist on the desk. You've made us homeless, Marcus. How could you? You're not homeless, Marcus said, unfazed. You still have the house you claim to have sold. Maybe it's time you moved back in and started taking responsibility for yourselves. We've always put this family first, Diane protested, tears streaming down her face. No, Marcus said firmly. You've always put yourselves first, and now you're facing the consequences of your choices. When Marcus told me about the confrontation, I couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. For the first time, someone was holding our parents accountable. But instead of owning up to their mistakes, they continued to cling to their delusion that they were the victims. The calls and texts from Diane and Thomas didn't stop. Every message was a variation of the same theme. You've ruined this family. Charlotte is devastated because of you. How could you do this to us? At first, I tried responding, explaining my side of things, but it didn't matter. They weren't listening. Even Charlotte, who had always relied on my parents' unwavering support, began to feel the fallout. Forced to move back into our parents' old house, she called me one evening, her voice heavy with frustration. Mom and Dad are cutting back on everything because of you and Marcus, she complained. Do you know how hard this is for me? I almost laughed. Do I know how hard it is? Charlotte, I've spent years working 2 jobs and living in poverty to support you. I think I have a pretty good idea. You're such a hypocrite, she snapped. You've abandoned your family. No, Charlotte, I said firmly. I've finally chosen myself. And maybe it's time you started choosing yourself too, in a way that doesn't involve taking from everyone else. She hung up, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I was done letting their accusations and guilt trips weigh me down. My parents could blame me all they wanted, but I knew the truth. I had given them everything, and they had given me nothing in return. Cutting ties wasn't easy, but it was the only way forward. Their denial and blame had been suffocating me for years, but now I could finally breathe. Breaking free from my family wasn't a decision I made lightly. It had taken years of manipulation, sacrifice, and emotional exhaustion to get to the point where I realized I couldn't keep living like this. But once the decision was made, there was no going back. After Marcus evicted my parents from his condo and exposed their lies about the rental income, I thought maybe they'd finally take responsibility. Instead, they doubled down on blaming me. My mother, Diane, called me constantly, guilt-tripping me about the so-called damage I'd caused. You're tearing this family apart, Alex, she said during one particularly heated conversation. Charlotte is devastated. She can't even face her friends. Do you know what you've done to her? What I've done to her? I said, my voice shaking with frustration. Mom, I've spent years working 2 jobs, giving up my own life, just to make sure she didn't have to lift a finger. And what did I get in return? Insults and demands for more. I'm done. That's not how family works, she shot back. We've always relied on you, Alex. You've always been the responsible one. No, Mom, I said firmly. You've always used me. There's a difference. The conversation ended with her slamming the phone down. But for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I felt lighter, as though I had finally taken the first step toward freeing myself from the weight they had placed on my shoulders. That step turned into a leap when I decided to cut ties completely. I stopped answering their calls and ignored their texts. Charlotte tried reaching out a few times, mostly to complain about how hard her life had become. Mom and Dad say they can't help me anymore because of you and Marcus, she said during one of her guilt-laden tirades. Do you know how embarrassing it is to live like this? You mean to live like the rest of us? I replied bluntly. Welcome to reality, Charlotte. She didn't like that answer and hung up on me, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I wasn't bending over backward to appease her, or anyone else in my family. It wasn't easy at first. There were nights when I lay awake, questioning whether I was doing the right thing. Decades of conditioning made it hard to shake the feeling that I was abandoning my family, that I was somehow a bad son or brother for walking away. But every time I started to doubt myself, I reminded myself of everything I'd given up for them, and how little they'd cared about what it had cost me. With Marcus's support, I slowly began to rebuild. I found a new job, one that didn't drain me physically or emotionally. It didn't pay as much as my old one, but it was enough to cover my expenses and still give me room to breathe. For the first time in years, I could actually save money instead of scrambling to send it off to Charlotte. I moved into a small but comfortable apartment and started focusing on myself for a change. I joined a local hiking group, rediscovering a love for nature that I hadn't had time to enjoy in years. I also signed up for a few online courses, learning skills I'd always been interested in, but had never had the time or energy to pursue. Every step I took toward reclaiming my life felt like a victory. Even my mental health began to improve. I started therapy, something I'd avoided for years because I thought I didn't have the time or money. Talking through everything I'd been through helped me see the bigger picture. I wasn't abandoning my family. I was saving myself. Months later, I realized just how much had changed. I no longer felt the constant weight of their expectations pressing down on me. The guilt that had once driven me to sacrifice everything was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and empowerment. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. My parents still try to reach out occasionally, but I didn't engage. I knew any conversation would just lead back to the same accusations and guilt trips, and I wasn't willing to let them drag me back into their toxic cycle. Charlotte, from what I heard through the grapevine, had taken a part-time retail job and was miserable. She blamed me for everything, of course, but I didn't care. Her opinion of me no longer mattered. Walking away from my family was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the best decision I've ever made. I'd spent years giving everything I had to people who only took, and now, for the first time, I was giving back to myself. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out. Breaking free from my family wasn't just about ending the toxic cycle I'd been trapped in. It was about reclaiming my life. The process wasn't instant, and it certainly wasn't easy. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to experience something I hadn't felt in years: peace. At first, the silence was strange. No more frantic calls from my mom asking for favors. No more texts from Charlotte demanding money. No more guilt-laden conversations. I had grown so used to their constant demands that I didn't know what to do with myself. But gradually, I started to fill that silence with things that brought me joy, things I had neglected for far too long. One of the first changes I made was in my daily routine. With my new job, I no longer had to juggle 2 shifts just to scrape by. I had evenings and weekends free, and I started using that time to take care of myself. I signed up for an online cooking class, something I'd always been curious about, but never had the time for. Before long, I was experimenting with recipes, trading instant noodles for fresh, home-cooked meals. Cooking became a small but meaningful act of self-care. I also joined a local hiking group. I hadn't realized how much I missed being outdoors until I laced up my old boots and hit the trails. There was something incredibly freeing about climbing a hill, feeling the strain in my legs, and looking out over the city from the summit. It felt like a metaphor for my life. Each step a reminder of how far I'd come and how much further I could go. Therapy became another cornerstone of my healing process. I'd avoided it for years, telling myself I didn't have the time or money, but now I understood how badly I needed it. Talking through everything, the years of sacrifice, the manipulation, the guilt, helped me make sense of it all. My therapist reminded me that setting boundaries wasn't selfish. It was necessary. That simple truth was a revelation. Financially, I finally had breathing room. Without the $1,000 weekly payments to Charlotte, I could start saving again. I even opened a small investment account, something I'd always wanted to do but had never been able to prioritize. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was drowning under the weight of other people's expectations. Most importantly, I reconnected with myself. I started reading books I'd put off for years, exploring new hobbies, and reaching out to old friends. I realized how much of my identity I had lost in trying to be everything for my family. Now, I was rebuilding that identity, not as someone else's provider, but as my own person. Looking back, I don't regret my decision to walk away. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. My family can blame me all they want, but I know the truth. For the first time in a long time, I'm living for myself, and that's something no one can take away from me.